Hello and welcome to the first of 3 short lectures for week 12. We'll be talking this week about the music of the early 20th century. This music falls under the general heading of modernism. Modernism was an artistic ideal that was popular among early 20th century artists of all types that sought to make a break with the past. And the first modernist movement that we're going to talk about is Impressionism. Impressionism actually got started before the 20th century, in the latter decades of the 19th century in France. Impressionism is strongly associated with the French, and all of the artists that we're going to talk about in this little lecture are themselves French. Before we delve into French Impressionism, though, I want to talk about the overarching concept of modernism. Your book makes modernism sound rather unpleasant in the chapter introduction. Modernist music is some of my favorite, actually, of what we get to talk about in this class, but it is deliberately challenging to the listener. And I think for that reason it deserves a little background, because a lot of times when I introduce this music to my students, their reaction is, what did you do with all the pretty music? Or why are these composers trying to hurt me? So I want to give a little bit of background. First of all, as we've seen throughout the semester, artists don't create art in a vacuum. They are responding to what they see in the world around them and what they see happening in society. And it's important to remember that in the early years of the 20th century, the world had changed profoundly over the last 100 years. If you think about 1800 in Europe or in the United States, almost everybody was living a rural lifestyle. The main occupation was being a farmer, living off the land. By the start of the 20th century, by 1900, most people lived in cities. The Industrial Revolution had transformed society. There were so many new technologies. If you think into the 19th century, you might think about the steam engine, railroads. If you start to think about the 20th century, you might think about things like indoor plumbing, or electricity, or recording technology, which is going to profoundly change the world of music. So things were very different at the start of the 20th century, and there really was a sense in society that there had been this profound change, and that people felt that they were living in kind of a brave new world. This shift in living conditions was mirrored by some important shifts in the way people thought about society and thought about themselves. And I always like to point out these 3 books that appeared in the second half of the 19th century that caused people to question deeply some of the most important ideas that they had about the world. The first one is Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species, which of course introduced his theory of natural selection and of evolution. And this is still challenging to many people today, because it questions, where did humanity originate? Where do we come from? The second book is Karl Marx's Das Kapital. I know that in Honors 101, many of you read the Communist Manifesto, which is sort of deals with many of the same ideas. Das Kapital is the much longer book, in which Marx and his colleague Friedrich Engels delve into economic theory. But here, this is basically questioning the way society is set up. Who should society benefit? How should we distribute economic means? And of course, the theory of communism is that things should be spread equally, in a very different way from what people were used to. And the last book, Sigmund Freud's The Interpretation of Dreams, I know that you also read some Freud in your honors classes. The interpretation of dreams is the one where Freud lays out his theory of the subconscious, that our conscious mind is, by analogy, like the tip of an iceberg. It's just about 10% of the iceberg shows above the surface. So a very small amount of our awareness is what we are conscious of, and then underneath it is the subconscious, which is most of our, according to Freud, most of our mind, and that's what motivates our decisions, our choices, and really forms our identity, makes us who we are. So this causes, the reader of Freud's theories to say, who am I? It's as if we don't even understand ourselves. And of these three great thinkers, Freud is perhaps the most influential over artists. We'll see when we return to the Expressionists, a group of artists who were directly influenced by these theories of the subconscious. Influenced by these changes in society and by these changes in thought, artists in the early 20th century were looking to make a break with the past. And this was true across the arts, in the visual arts, in literature, and certainly in music. And these early 20th century movements that sought to make a break with the past are generally grouped under the heading of modernism. And that's a confusing term because it sounds like modernism should be actually modern, but modernism is not modern anymore. It is not contemporary. It's a historical style. It's better to think of it that the artists of modernism were being self-consciously modern. They were establishing themselves as of their time and trying to make a break with the artistic expressions of the past. This three-word slogan for modernism is attributed to the American poet Ezra Pound. It's said that when asked for advice by a younger poet for how he should write, Ezra Pound uttered this three-word phrase: "Make it new." Whatever you're going to do, make it different from what came before. And I think that three-word slogan, "Make it new," is a good way to sum up the artistic spirit of modernism. What happened with these groups of artists that were trying to make a break from the past was they tended to band together in little groups or little tribes and kind of say, we have the art of the future. We have an art that's responsive to this new time that we're living in. And so what we see in the early 20th century are these groups of artists that are identified by a word that ends in ism, like the Impressionists or the Expressionists or the Cubists, or et cetera, et cetera. So one of the first groups of artists to make this self-conscious break with the past was a group of French painters. And they became known as the Impressionists. Their name was actually drawn from this picture that you're looking at right here. The title that painter Claude Monet gave this picture was Impression Sunrise. Monet loved to paint scenes that had some ambiguity. So he loved to paint scenes that include fog or water, where the viewer has to interpret a little bit what you're actually looking at. And Monet's canvases and the canvases of the other Impressionists become this sort of study in light and color that has become very popular and very beloved, I think, among audiences, but at the time was very challenging because painting was thought of as a way to represent realistically what the world looked like. So when you looked at a canvas, the expectation was it was like you were looking through a window into another world that was clearly and realistically rendered. So this type of representation was very, very challenging to its audiences. And I put the date on this slide just so that you could see that this is actually a late 19th century movement. So even though we associate modernism with the early 20th century, and your book is a little bit particular about this and says that maybe Impressionism shouldn't be counted as modernism, I'm going to take a different approach and say that I think Impressionism is a modernist movement. In fact, I think it is the first modernist movement, just because it doesn't fall with, its origins don't fall within the 20th century. I think we can still see many of the aspects that I want you to associate with modernism with this movement. One of Monet's favorite strategies in his painting was to paint a single scene over and over at different times of the day, or in different seasons, or with different effects of weather, whether it's cloudy or sunny or stormy, and to show sort of the different play of color and light that resulted from each one of those situations. So this is a rather late painting by Monet of a medieval cathedral located in the French town of Rouen. And I feel like these canvases give a good visual idea of what the Impressionists were going for, which was the suggestion of a scene rather than the outright representation of that scene. And in a sense, a lot of times, as these canvases require a little bit more from the viewer, in that your eye has to piece together exactly what it is that you're looking at. Are you looking at a spire? Are you looking at a stained glass window in this picture? What exactly, are we seeing? So the fundamental idea, I think, of Impressionism can be boiled down to this idea that things are suggested rather than outright represented. There's a celebration of ambiguity and mystery in these paintings that is different from the art of the past. This was in line with other movements in French arts at the same time. In literature, there's a movement called symbolism, which tried to do the same thing in many ways in writing that these painters were trying to do in visual works. And that is to suggest ideas and literary themes without coming out and saying them. The symbolist writers used literary symbols in what they believed was a very suggestive way that could bring explore new and deep levels of meaning. The French composer who tried to translate the aesthetic of the Impressionist painters and the symbolist writers into music is Claude Debussy. And he tried to create this sense of suggestiveness or ambiguity in his music with some particular elements that we can highlight. The first one that I'm going to talk about is the importance of timbre or tone color. And I think you can see how that's sort of a direct analogy to painting. In the same way the Impressionist painters use color in innovative ways on their canvases, Debussy uses tone color in innovative ways in his pieces. And in fact, tone color is highlighted as a musical element in his pieces. No matter what instrument Debussy was writing for, if he was writing for the piano, he uses the pedals, like the sustain pedal, for special effects, or he uses the extreme registers of the instrument, the extreme high register or extreme low register, to create some special colors. When Debussy writes for the orchestra, he often uses some of the added instruments that we saw added to the orchestra in the 19th century. For instance, in the recording you're going to watch, you will see very prominently featured the English horn, which is that low oboe. That's a special color that Debussy highlights in the piece you're going to listen to. In that piece, the Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun, he begins the entire piece with the flute playing completely alone, so that you're drawn to focus on a single instrumental color. And he has the flute play in its middle register, which is kind of a very empty sounding kind of special register of the instrument. So Debussy is very careful and very interested in different ways of using color in his pieces. A second way that Debussy, that's important to Debussy's aesthetic of ambiguity, is the way he uses harmony. Debussy uses chords simply for their sound value, and that is a radical idea. We've studied harmony as a way of organizing the pitches in a piece to create expectations for you as a listener. We've talked about how chords create the sense that you're in a key where one pitch, the tonic, is the most important, and the piece has cadences on that tonic pitch. That idea of cadence and indeed of a central tonic pitch are very much weakened in the music of Debussy. And honestly, in this way, Debussy is in some ways responding to the music of the 19th century and composers like Wagner. You'll remember that Wagner, in his operas, used a lot of chromaticism, incorporated a lot of pitches from outside the key. So he was already weakening that sense of tonal center. So if the Romantic composers were sort of looking for innovative ways to weaken that sense of harmonic motion, Debussy just throws it completely out the window. However, Debussy favors consonant chords. He tends to like sonorities that are, for the most part, pleasing to the ear. So it's easy to kind of not notice how radical his conception is. However, this idea of sort of lack of harmonic motion gives his music kind of a floating, ambiguous feeling that I think is special to his style. Also contributing to that sense of sort of floating is Debussy's use of rhythm. He favors rhythms that often do not indicate a clear meter, or in some cases even a steady beat. And if you try to tap your foot during the flute solo that begins the piece you're going to listen to, I think you'll see exactly what I mean. It's hard to find the beat in that piece, and that is completely on purpose for Debussy. And finally, Debussy's approach to musical form is often somewhat ambiguous. What I mean by that is you'll hear melodies and themes that repeat, but they do not repeat in any sort of order or in an organized, formal pattern that you can recognize. So sonata allegro form, rondo form, where there are listener expectations for when a theme or an idea is going to come back, those are gone too. So in the piece you're going to listen to, the Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun, which I think your book does a good job of introducing, you'll hear that opening flute melody repeated as the piece goes on. But if you don't know the piece, it's pretty hard to tell when it's going to come back. And each time it comes back, it's often varied in some way. The accompaniment is different, or the theme has been changed in some way, so that you're aware that you're hearing something you've heard before, but it's constantly shifting and changing. In the same way that, as Monet was painting those scenes, he was tracing, the shifting and changing colors and effects of light. I hope that gives you some background to listen to Claude Debussy's Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun. You'll find the link to a live performance that you can watch in the Week 12 folder.